Your Bible's still open to 2 Samuel chapter 18. If you need the notes, just hold your hand up. The men are ready to serve you with those. Lester Roloff, an old, long ago evangelist, once preached a message called "The Mule Walked On." About Absalom there with his head stuck in the tree and the mule walked on. You say, "Preacher, what did it mean?" In his message, it meant absolutely nothing. He was preaching. He'd preach against things and preach against this and preach against that. And he'd stop and say, "And the mule walked on." Then he'd preach some more on this and preach some more. And then he'd say, "And the mule walked." Kind of like pawing in the valley. He had another message like that. It talked about the stallions of war pawing in the valley. And he'd just be preaching about something. And he'd stop and say, "I'm just pawing in the valley." Then he'd preach some more. But we're not doing it that way tonight. We're looking at the message that'll be a help for us if you let it, looking at, "Oh, Absalom, it did not have to end this way." 2 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 33, it says, "And the king said, and the king was much moved, and went up to his chamber over the gate and wept." Picture David weeping over his son that was dead. "And as he went, he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee. O Absalom, my son, my son." The name Absalom means father of peace. If that's not a misnomer for Absalom's life, I don't know what is. He had no peace. He didn't have a life of peace. His very early years we don't know about, but later on there was no peace in his life. And it was a sad ending, a very sad ending for a man of great potential. He was the king's son. And we'll see other qualities that God had given him. But he was the king's son. He had all the opportunity, all the potential of having a great and profitable life. Yet it ended in tragedy. It ended in heartbreak. It ended just in a mess. But when you know the story and you go back and read your Bible again and you come to that, you can see it developing. You can see it working up. You can see where it goes. You can see as he develops and as he grows and as he makes those decisions in his life. You can tell it's probably not going to end well, and you can just see it grow and develop. I've seen it happen in people's lives for the same reasons we'll see tonight. A sad ending where it didn't have to be that way. A tragic ending where it didn't have to be that way. And I see the opportunity for the devil to do the same thing today even more. In your life or in my life, we can find ourselves at the end of our life in such a tragedy as Absalom. So tonight we're looking at it in two aspects. One, as a caution to us, as a caution for the young people, as a caution for all of us, that we not let it end in tragedy. We not let our life end in despair. We don't let our lives end and be so wrapped up and so destroyed by the devil. But secondly, as I studied that, we'll have a better understanding of other people. Because as I was studying this and looking about this last week, different people's, maybe I shouldn't say this, but different people's faces come to mind. Not in a bad way, but I think I understand a little bit more, maybe, why they're the way they are. Maybe I can understand a little bit more why they react the way they do. Maybe I can understand a little bit more why they speak the way they do, the decisions they've made, because these other events are in their life. And it burdens my heart as I think about it. So tonight as we look at this thing, it did not have to end this way, and look at the life of Absalom and why it didn't have to end that way and how it got to that place. You and I would put ourselves on guard so we will make the changes that are necessary, but also maybe we'll have a little more understanding about people and understand where they are and can pray for them and can help them along the way. Now, as we look at this passage tonight and look at this truth, any of us could be kind of on hold in some of these spots. Because as we see it progress, as we see the different issues in his life, sometimes we can get to a place and we'll just kind of be on hold right there. We can be in that little spot, in that little crevice, kind of waiting and thinking we're all right, and then something come along and we can move farther in the wrong direction. So tonight, let's let God speak to our hearts, and guard our hearts and make some decisions tonight. Not think about anybody else except as God would put somebody on your heart to pray for, to think about, maybe understand why they are the way they are, but also that we can learn and we can be on guard and we can pray for our young folks and our people that we not have to let it end that way. How tragic. Absalom killed by Joab and those other servants, and David weeping and crying over the death of his son, who had been such a heartache for him for years already. So very quickly tonight, let's learn about why it did not have to end this way. How did this tragedy come upon us and upon him so we can be on guard? Number one, this great tragedy, this sad ending on Absalom's life, this sad ending where David was crying like that. Number one, it was triggered by his father. It was triggered by his father. It was David that helped bring this on in his life. David in his life had done some things, and his family had just messed up ever since then. We know what it's like when it happens. It was David's immorality and his passion was one of the things that brought it on. We know from David when he sinned with Bathsheba, and from then on it was just a mess. His home was just a wreck from then on. David didn't deal with it properly. David didn't deal with his own life right. And it was just that immorality and passion that he had with Bathsheba just helped bring on, I believe, this issue with Absalom and his whole family. See, moms and dads, our sin affects our kids also. Our sin, our lifestyle, our decisions, our attitudes, our reactions, our dealings with our spouse, our dealings with other folks, it affects our home all the way through. It affects our children and our grandchildren. That's one of the reasons we have to be on guard for what we do and be on guard, if nothing else for ourselves, nothing else for the glory of God, but also for our children. We find that Absalom here had a heart issue, had an attitude issue, and I believe it was triggered by his father. You say, preacher, so how can I avoid that? Forgive your parents. Let's learn to forgive our parents tonight. You didn't have perfect parents. Nobody had perfect parents. You're not a perfect parent. But let's go ahead and understand as we look at Absalom's life, if he would have helped him along the way just a little bit, if he could have forgiven his father, if he could have forgiven David for his sin, could have forgiven David for his failures and the passion that David had. So it was triggered by his father, David's immorality and passion. But also, I believe, more so, it was even triggered by his father and by his parent, by David's impotency in parenting. His impotency in parenting. He was not a strong parent. He was a great general. He was a great king. He was mighty in many ways. But as far as parenting goes, he had no strength. As parenting goes, he was not effective. As parenting goes, he was not all that he should have been. He just did not know how to discipline, or at least he did not discipline. What brought this on, as we know, if you know the story of Absalom, and Amnon, his brother, and the rape, Amnon raped Absalom's sister. And in 2 Samuel chapter 13, we won't go to the whole story because we're just focusing on Absalom tonight. But in 2 Samuel 13, verse number 20, and Absalom, her brother, said unto her, this is after Amnon had his way with his sister, hath Amnon thy brother been with thee? But now hold thy peace, my sister. He is thy brother. Regard not this thing. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. But the king David heard all these things. All right, so we've got this immorality that took place inside his household. Between the brother and a daughter, he forced himself upon her. Absalom knew about it. She was now taken out and lived in Absalom's house. And David heard about it. So it was not unknown to David. David heard about it. David knew about it. And it says, and David heard all these things. He was very wroth. David heard about it and he was angry. David heard about it and he was stirred. David heard about it and he knew how wrong it was. He knew how vile it was. He knew how wretched it was. But that's where it ended. The next verse says, and 2 years later. David never dealt with it. David never took control. David never went, that's all we can tell. He never went to Amnon. He never went to the daughter. He just got angry with it. For 2 years it just sat there. Now, I know it stirred David's heart. It says he was angry, but not only that, I think it made David uncomfortable for the rest of his life. It made David uncomfortable for at least the next 2 or 3 years. I say that because when Absalom, if you know the story, Absalom then killed his brother because of that. 2 years later, Absalom had a party, if you will, had a picnic, and all men went, and he had all his men kill Absalom at the appropriate time. And when David heard that Absalom had killed Amnon. And it says, and the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, because Absalom then fled. Absalom went on the lam. Absalom ran out of the country. And David heard about it, and the soul of David longed to go forth unto Absalom. So when David heard that Absalom had fled after killing his brother, he longed for Absalom, it says, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. Are you getting the idea how confusing that is? That David would be longing for Absalom, who just killed Amnon, but David now is glad that Amnon is dead and Absalom killed him. Because no doubt, David was still, after 2 years, still stewing on that, still worried about that. He said, I ought to do something, I should have done something. He no doubt would look at Tamar and say, every time he saw her, or Absalom would speak about her, he'd say, boy, what a shame that is that my son would do that to her, and I haven't done anything. What should I do? What can I do? And he was just stirred up. And so when he heard that Absalom had killed Amnon because of what he did for his sister, it says David was comforted. I don't know how bad you got to be hurting to be comforted by the death of a son. I don't know how bad you have to be hurting to be comforted by one brother killing another. But he was. I believe that was one of the keys why Absalom had such a heart attitude and a problem, and it ended in tragedy. Yes, because of David's immorality, but also David's inability to parent. Because Absalom then just was waiting to see. He said, don't do anything, don't say anything. He said that to his sister that had been abused by the brother. He says, he's your brother. He says, you stay in my house. But he waited for 2 years and nothing happened. Boy, that would stir Absalom. In fact, it said, the Bible tells us he killed Amnon because of what he had done to his sister. The Bible tells us, parents, Ephesians 6:4, and ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Colossians 3:21, fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. We have to make sure our discipline, our leadership in the home, dads and moms, is consistent, it's right, it's clear, and it's holy. Hello. It's real easy for us to let things down. It's real easy when we get uncomfortable about something to say, I'm not going to deal with it. It's real easy for us when we get kind of, I'm not sure what to do, so I won't do anything. I don't know about you, but you can look back in your own home life. I was raised in a good home. There was no immorality in my home. There was no abuse in my home as I was growing up. But many folks can't say that. They look back and they see abuse. They see neglect. They see inappropriate behavior. They see no love. They see inconsistency in the parents. One day they're spanking them hard. One day they're not doing anything. And we find that makes the children, angry. That brings them to wrath. You see, it's not the strong discipline that brings children to wrath. It's the inconsistency in the strong discipline that brings them to wrath. It's the fact that today I'm in big trouble and I'm spanked hard for this, but tomorrow I do something worse and it's different and it doesn't happen. Or it doesn't happen to my brother, or it doesn't happen to my sister. It's consistency, knowing what the rules are, knowing the ramifications of the rules, and then following up consistently in love and spiritually and rightly, like the Bible dictates. That brings consistency in the home. But inconsistency and impotency in the discipline of our children, that can bring our children to wrath. So let's focus on making sure that we're consistent in it. But David here, it was triggered. Absalom's tragic end was triggered by his parent, by his father. So let's make sure that, again, our life is not one of immorality. Our life has one that's a good example in our passions, but also that we learn to be right in our discipline. Now, how many have figured out disciplined children is a challenge? Well, it's no challenge until you have some. Remember what it was like? Before you had a kid, you could tell everybody just how to train their children. This is what you ought to do. This is what you ought to say. This is how you ought to spank. This is how you ought to do this. And then you get your kids and you say, I don't want to spank them. Or what do I do now? Or the child doesn't respond to the discipline like you thought they would. But it was triggered by his father. It was triggered by his parents. So Absalom, no doubt David understood that. No doubt David, that's why he wept and he said, I wish I could have died for you. Because David knew of his own immorality. He also knew of his own consistency. That's why he could say he was comforted at the death of Amnon, killed by Absalom, because he had been carrying that load all along. was triggered by his parent. Number 2. So again, let me go back. So how do we avoid that in our lives? Forgive your parents. Forgive your parents. You say, but they were just inconsistent. They were immoral. They didn't do it right. Listen, all right, for your sake, learn to forgive your parents for it. Absalom, if Absalom could have just said, all right, Dad is a mess. Dad was a mess with Bathsheba. He didn't deal with that. If you could just forgive it. But instead, he carried that. Instead, he was burdened by that himself. And that belongs. So if nothing else tonight, folks, learn to forgive your parents. They're just people. They're just flesh and blood. They're just sinners, just like you, just like me. They may have done some wrong things. They may have done some bad things. But to keep us from ending up where Absalom did, let's make sure we learn to forgive our parents. By the way, Christ died for their sins also. He was triggered by his father, by his parents. So forgive your parents. Number 2, he was trapped by his vanity. He was trapped by his vanity. We are so pulled in and we are just so vain. We're so concerned about our looks, if not about our looks, but the acceptance of our looks. I mean, we want to make sure that when people look at us, we're accepted by them. We want to make sure when people look at us, they think well of us. We want to make sure that our dress is just right, our fashion is just right. We're just fitting in like the rest of the world, that we do not look too odd, we do not look too strange. Absalom was trapped by his own vanity. Let's not be so concerned about how we look. Hello? Are you out there tonight? Let's don't be so concerned about how we look. You can't tell me the people that have the tattoos all over their arms, all over their neck, all over their face, said, boy, I sure want to be like, I sure want that on my body. No, they want to fit in. They want people to see them and accept them and take all the tattoos, all the marks on the body, all the piercings that we have. Let's be careful about vanity, worrying about how we look on the outside. Absalom was trapped by his own vanity. So the solution to that is, so forsake vanity. Forsake vanity. Absalom was so vain about his own appearance, so vain about his own life, so vain. It was all about Absalom. In fact, in verse number 18, 2 Samuel 18, verse number 18, it says, now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and reared up for himself a pillar, which is in the king's dale. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. Now, the Bible tells us just a few verses up, he did have three sons. But they must be dead at this point. They must have been killed in battle. So they're dead. But now at this point in his life, he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name, and is called unto this day Absalom's place. So Absalom constructed his own heir. He said, I got to have an heir. I got to have people something to remember me. So he built a statue, he built a pillar, and called it by his own name. I'd say he was a little vain. I'd say he's a little concerned about his appearance. He was a little concerned about what people thought about him. He was a little concerned that nobody's going to remember him afterward. So he put a pillar up because he had no kids and called it his name and put it there in the king's place. Let's be more concerned about our spiritual testimony and legacy than just the world remembering us, what God knows about us. But not only that did he construct his own heir, but here's the key about how we know he was trapped by his own vanity. We read about it. He's got his hair stuck in the tree. He was caught by his own hair. He was caught by his own hair. 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse number 25. Second Samuel 14, verse 25. But in all Israel, that means everywhere in Israel, there was none to be so much praised as Absalom for his what class? Beauty. From the sole of his foot even to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. He was amazing. He was a good-looking guy. He was the best-looking guy in all Israel. I mean, he's the kind of guy, when he would walk down the street, the women would swoon. Woo, look at that. They'd say, wow, what a man. Whoa, look at him. Now, they didn't have posters in those days, but if they did, Absalom would be on their wall. It would be that sort of thing. For Coke commercials, they didn't have Coke commercials then, but if they did, they'd want Absalom to drink the Coke because he was the best-looking man in the whole country. He was good looking. The ladies would swoon and the guys would get jealous. He was that, from the sole of his foot to the top of his head. I mean, he could walk up to you and say, you want to see a good looking foot? Look at there. You want to see that? Boy, you want to see some good hair? Look at there. Boy, he was good looking. Oh, if it wasn't, no, we won't go there. It'd be like, I'm going to show my age now. Back in the early 60s, on the Ed Sullivan Show. Anybody remember the Ed Sullivan Show? There was a group of shaggy-haired little guys that came out with their guitars and sang about wanting to hold your hand and shake their head, and the girls would faint. Anybody else remember that? Oh my, they would faint. They'd say, oh, there they are, and they would faint over. That's what Absalom was, that good looking. He was the best looking. Notice it goes on. 2 Samuel 14:25. But in all Israel there's none to be so much praised as Absalom for his beauty. From the sole of his foot even to the crown of his head there was no blemish in him. There was no birthmarks. There was no ugly things about it. He was just handsome. Verse 26. And when he pulled his head, for it was at every year's end, pulled his head means he got a haircut. Okay, so he shaved his head. He got a haircut once a year. And he pulled it because his hair was very heavy on him. So he let his hair grow long, and it got so heavy, he said, boy, I got to get a haircut. So he got a haircut. Therefore he pulled it. He weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels after the king's weight. That was about 6 to 8 pounds. So he got a haircut once a year. He let that hair grow. And as it grew out, he'd go and finally said, I just can't take it anymore. And he'd get a haircut and he'd weigh it. It was weighing about 6 to 8 pounds. That's a lot of hair. And so now Absalom, in his beauty, in his good looks, in his concern that everybody would know about him, so he built his little pillar, but also with that long hair that was going on behind him, and that was the whole point. He got caught by his own hair. I mean, as he was riding that mule through the battle, coming through the battle, going through the trees, and he came up underneath that oak, and no doubt while he was riding, his hair was just a-flying. Oh, it gives me a headache. Maybe that's why I don't have long hair. But his hair was fine, and his hair got tangled up in the tree, and the mule walked on. The mule went on, and so there he was, just hanging there. No doubt he struggled, no doubt he but it was his hair. Hair was tangled up. And while he was hanging there, the enemy came and they saw him and said, there he is. There's David's enemy. There's David's son, but also the one who's been taken over for David and one we're at battle with. We're at war with him. And so Joab said, what'd you do? And the guy said, well, I'm not going to touch him because I know the King David said, don't you touch him. Joab says, I'll take care of him. So he went and got his darts and threw 3 darts into him while he was alive, 3 spears into him, and the other men gathered around and killed him. There with that hair. I can't imagine why else he would have hair except he just thought it was so beautiful. It just went with his appearance and all that he had. So I was teaching part of this in chapel. I just have to remember, the Bible says, I'm going to go ahead and go there. Can I go there tonight? I'm going to go there anyway. The Bible says it's a shame for a man to have long hair. That's what it says. Well, somebody smile at me out there. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14. Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him? But if a woman have long hair, it is a glory for her hair is given for a covering. God says it's a shame for a man to have long hair, and it's glory for a woman to have long hair. God says there's a difference between men and women in more ways than one. Hello? He says men are supposed to have the short hair. He said anything else is a shame. He said nature teaches us that. That's normal. That men should have short hair, but ladies should have long hair. There's a difference. Besides in our physical bodies, also in our appearances, God wants to put a separation between men and women. That's why women are not supposed to wear that which pertaineth to a man, and men are not supposed to wear that which pertaineth to a woman. Our haircuts are supposed to be different between a man and a woman. Hello? Because God is not for the unisex movement. This whole thing of coming to the place where we can't tell whether it's a guy or a girl, and now we're to the place where we can't tell our kids they're a guy or a girl. We're to the place now where the courts are saying, no, you can't put on the birth certificates in some places, whether they're a guy or a girl. You can't force it on it. You just let them decide a little bit later. I got news for you. God already decided what they were. But the twisting of the head and the twisting of the mind, listen, 30 years ago, we'd never thought about that. But this unisex movement of where the guys are looking like girls and the girls are looking like guys and the boys are acting like girls and the girls are acting like boys, and it's just convoluted. That's why God says, no, you don't wear what pertaineth to the other, and you don't have haircuts that look like the other. Hello. That's why God talks about how wrong it is for the effeminate. God doesn't like the unisex movement. Here we have Absalom. There was such long hair weighing 6 to 8 pounds, and it caught him in the end. By the way, our vanity will often trap us. That thing that you hold so dear, that thing that you want to be liked by the world. You want the people to like the way you dress. You want people to like the way you look. That'll trap you so often. He was trapped in the tree by his hair. Sometimes people say, preacher, how long is long? I got an answer for you. It's the opposite of short. Oh, is that hard to understand? We make that so hard. How long is the opposite of short? So if my hair's not short, it must be long. All right, good. His vanity. He was good looking. He had the hair that he would... Why else would he weigh it? Boy, my hair is really something. Let me show you how much... I've had a lot of haircuts. I've never weighed my hair. But in the end, it killed him. In the end, it got him. Yeah. Here's key. Do the best, as far as our looks go, do the best to make yourself look as good as you can with what God gave you, and to stop worrying about it. I mean, you do the best you can, but then you don't say, oh, do they think I'm handsome? Do they think I'm good looking? Do they think I'm pretty? Well, I'm worried about this. No, do the best you can with what God has given you, and then just don't worry about it. The problem is, in today's society, that's all we worry about is how we look. That's why we got guys wearing pants that can't stay up. That's why we got girls that wearing dresses that are too short. That's why we've got all the issues, because we're worried about the vanity. Absalom's vanity got him. Didn't have to end this way. It was triggered by his father. Trapped by his vanity. Number 3, he was taken by his anger. He was taken by his anger. Back in 2 Samuel 13:22. And Absalom spake unto his brother Amnon. See, in verse 21, David heard about the situation that Amnon had forced his sister. And when King David heard all these things, he was very wroth. And Absalom spake unto his brother Amnon, neither good nor bad. He wouldn't say anything. He wasn't talking to him. He wasn't talking to him good. He wasn't talking to him bad. For Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced his sister Tamar. In verse 23, you see where it says, and it came to pass after 2 full years. David hadn't done anything in 2 years. But it said, for Absalom hated Amnon. His anger made him a hater. His anger made him a hater. No doubt he was angry, but then he began to hate. So that's why God warns us about being careful about our anger. Because that anger, as it begins to fester, that anger as we let it reside, that anger as it begins to grow in us, can destroy us. Absalom, he had issues before this. He had issues, no doubt, about his dad. But at this point, he became so angry. He became angry, and his anger made him a hater. He began to hate Amnon. And he stewed on it for year after year. And as he would stew at it, no doubt he would then think about David and think about why David hadn't done things. And it just got worse, and it got worse, and it got worse. So his anger made him a hater. He was taken by his anger. He was taken control by his anger. It didn't have to end that way, but at this point he was so angry. That's why the Bible tells us and warns us. In Ephesians 4:26, be ye angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath, neither give place to the devil. God knows that when we let anger get a hold of us, then we're giving a place for the devil in our life. When we let anger get a hold of our spirit, we're letting the devil get a hold and a place in our life. I'm saying if you and I can be honest and look back at different times in our life, we've let anger hurt us. We've let anger to the place where the devil then comes into our heart. We give him place in our home. It may be against a spouse. It may be against the kids. It may be against our parents. It may be against somebody in the church. But that anger comes in and it changes into hate, and the devil has a foothold in our home and in our heart. He was taken by anger. How in the world did Absalom get to the place where we see at the end it ended in such tragedy? Anger took him. It says, be angry and sin not. That means we've got to be angry at the right thing. Do you know God gets angry? We need to be angry at the right thing. That means we need to be angry at the sin and not the individual. Are you listening to me? We need to be angry at the sin and not the individual. And not be angry at what they've done to us, but rather what they've done. And more so what they've done to themselves and for the cause of Christ. Be angry and sin not. Our anger. I see sometimes young folks who have an angry spirit. Boy, and it burdens my heart. I can see when they look at you how they act just with that angry spirit. That's not going to end well. Unless God gets a hold of that anger, unless God can turn that heart, unless God can soothe that anger, unless they can lose that anger, it's not going to end well. Their relationship with their parents is not going to go well. Their relationship with their future spouse is not going to go well. Their future relationship with their kids is not going to go well. Do you understand what anger can do to your heart? Do you understand what anger can do to your life? Absalom here was so angry, he hated his brother far. I said, preacher, I just can't help myself. All right, if you're going to be angry, one day, let not the sun go down on your wrath. That means when you're having your quiet time at night or the first thing in the morning and you say, boy, I'm still mad, you got a problem. Keep those short accounts. His anger made him a hater. Well, I'm just so mad. Did you ever see somebody who just hates? It's that anger that's been festering. That anger his anger made him a killer. His anger made him a killer. You say, how in the world could he have killed his brother? How in the world could people kill people? It's just anger. After the 2 years, he went to his dad. I told you how he took his men with him and took all the brothers out. And he had his men. He said, when I give you the signal, kill him. And they did. Jesus says in Matthew 5:21, ye have heard it been said of old time, thou shalt not kill. Whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you, whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. We may not kill somebody physically, but we kill him in our mind, we kill him in our heart, we kill him in our spirit. And you're just as much a murderer in your heart as if you did it physically. It made him a killer. Doesn't have to end that way. Oh, Absalom. Didn't have to end that way. It was triggered by his parents. He was trapped by his vanity, worried about himself. He was taken by his anger, and here's the key for tonight. He was tortured by his bitterness. He was tortured by his bitterness. So, preacher, what do I do about my bitterness? Root it out. Root it out. Hebrews 12:15. Looking diligently lest any man fail of the grace of God. In other words, God's grace will help you through that. We don't have to be bitter. Hello? We don't have to be bitter. God's grace is sufficient. The supernatural working of God in our hearts and lives can help us get past that bitterness. Looking diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. If you just wanted to boil it down to what Absalom's big problem was, he was bitter with his dad. He was bitter at what happened to his brother and sister. He was bitter at the world. That bitterness began to eat him up. That bitterness defiled him. And that bitterness changed his life. It started with the fact that he became angry, and that anger began to fester, and he began to hate, and he began to think about his dad's sin and his dad's situation, and dad not dealing with it, and he just became bitter. And it just controlled his life, and it controlled his heart, and it just redirected his whole life to a tragic end. I'm challenging you tonight for all of us to look if there's any bitterness in our heart. heart. It doesn't matter if you got bitter yesterday or you got bitter 30 years ago. We have to deal with it, or we're liable to end up with a sad end like Absalom. We must deal with the bitterness very quickly. And this is where it'll help you as you look at other people sometimes. You say, what is their problem? It's a bitterness in people's hearts. Not to condemn them, but so we can pray for them, so we can understand them. Or when we respond the wrong way, we can see it in our own lives. Very quickly, he was tortured by bitterness. How in the world could he end up that way? He was tortured by bitterness. Number one, bitterness made him rebellious. Bitterness made him rebellious. He was a rebellious young man. We don't know earlier, but after he got angry at Amnon, after he got that bitterness in his heart at his dad, he became very rebellious. He tried and did take over David's throne. Say, why would he do that? He was bitter. He was bitter, and it made him rebellious. And then he tried to take his dad's life when he took over the throne. Well, I talk with our young folks. Be careful about bitterness. Bitterness will make you rebellious. You'll rebel against your parents. Adults, bitterness will make you rebellious. You'll rebel against the pastor. You'll rebel against your spouse. You'll rebel against God. Be careful about bitterness. It made him a rebellious young man. He was so rebellious because of bitterness. Number two, bitterness made him cruel. It made him a cruel man. Not only was he just rebellious, but he was cruel. Just write it down if it's not in your notes. 2 Samuel 14:30. He burned Joab's field. Remember, he said, Joab, I want to talk to you. And he wouldn't come, so he burned his field down. Whew. Well, that was pretty tough. Why was he so cruel? He was bitter. He said, Dad's not right, and Dad wouldn't take care of me. And even when I'm back, he says, Dad won't talk to me anymore. He said, I'm just bitter at Dad, and Joab, you're not talking to me. I'm going to burn your house down. I'm going to burn your field down. It made him cruel. Have you seen bitterness in people's lives, or maybe your own life do that? It makes you rebellious. It makes you cruel. Bitterness made him hypocritical. It made him hypocritical. 2 Samuel 14, verse 33. Again, Absalom, after killing his brother, fled and for years was gone. Joab came and convinced him and said, well, you need to bring Absalom back. David said, all right, let's bring Absalom back. Verse 33 of chapter 14. And so Joab came to the king and told him, and when he called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. So there we have some reconciliation, or it looks like reconciliation. It looks like they're getting along. Here Absalom comes, he bows down before his father the king. The king stands him up, gives him a kiss. Boy, everything's well. Everything's good. Everything's going well now. It's all taken care of. Verse 1, chapter 15. And it came to pass after this that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. And it was so that when any man that had a controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called him and said, of what city art thou? And he said, thy servant is one of thy tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, see, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed for the king to hear thee. And he goes on and says, moreover, and Absalom said, moreover, oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or any cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. And on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Do you see how hypocritical he was? Dad, everything's fine. Oh, Dad, I sure love you. You're the king, I'm sure. Oh, we're just so good. And when I said, I'm going to get him. He went right out and said, I've got a plan. I'm going to go ahead and steal the hearts of the people. I'm going to take over the kingdom. See, he was just hypocritical. Have you seen, folks, the bitterness? It'll happen in your life. You'll say, you'll put on a good front. You'll put on a good show. We'll put on, boy, everything's fine. Everything's okay. And as soon as their backs turn, you stab them in the back. As soon as their back turns, you've got other plans. As soon as the back turns, you're just being hypocritical. Again, I'm not talking about trying to judge people. I'm trying to understand people. I'm trying to guard in my life. I'm trying to help you guard in your life. I'm trying to understand, well, how in the world can people be so angry? How in the world can people be so cruel? How can they be so hypocritical? It's bitterness in their hearts. That's why God says, let's root out that bitterness or it'll defile you. Bitterness made him rebellious. Bitterness made him cruel. Bitterness made him hypocritical. Bitterness made him manipulative. Manipulative. Again, we just read about it. He began to manipulate the hearts of the people. Everybody that came to town, he says, tell me your story. He tells him the story and says, oh, if I was judge, I'd be on your side. Your side is right. I can almost hear the next day the other guy on the other side of the case would come and say, your side is right too. Just manipulated the people. Manipulated the situation. He did that for David. When he wanted to kill Amnon, he went and manipulated David. He said, King, he says, Dad, I want all the brothers to get together. We want to go have a picnic over here on this side. David said, I don't think everybody ought to get together. David suspected something. He said, I don't think everybody ought to get together. He said, no, let's all get together. He says, all right. And that's where he killed him. He was manipulative. By the way, we're not to be manipulative. We're to be truthful. Truthful. In deed and in word. But he began to manipulate people. Bitterness. He said, I'm so mad at Dad. I'm so bitter at Dad in this situation. And he began to manipulate things. Very quickly, bitterness, boy, and I see this often, so often, made him immoral. His bitterness made him immoral. 2 Samuel 16, verse 21. David's on the run. Absalom has just taken over the city. And Athaliah said unto Absalom, go into thy father's concubines, which he hath left to keep the house. And all Israel shall see that thou art abhorred of thy father. Then shall the hands of all men that are with thee be strong. So they spread Absalom a tent upon the top of the house, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. How wicked. How vile. How immoral. But why did he do that? He's getting back at Dad. That's what he's doing. He said, you do that and everybody know that you're against your dad. You do that and they'll know that you and your dad are not on the right par. They'll know about you and your dad. And it says their hands will be strengthened on your side. Jacob and Esau. Esau and his bitterness did the same thing. Remember when it talks about Jacob and Esau, you know the story about how brothers were against each other and how Jacob had tricked his brother and stolen the birthright. And the Bible says when Esau saw that the ladies of that community displeased his parents, he went and married one. They don't like it, I'm going to get one. See, because when we get bitter, we may not even be aware of it. But in order to lash out, in order to get back, in order to have an outlet for that bitterness, we're liable to get immoral. I've seen young ladies as they get bitter at their parents when they grow up, there's an immorality that comes. A looseness that comes. Young men who have bitterness at their parents or bitterness at society or bitterness at the church ended up in an immoral place, immoral action. That's why God says, let's root out the bitterness lest we be defiled. Absalom didn't have to end that way. Didn't have to end that way. So let's tonight make sure we're not on that same path. Make sure that we're, again, you might be stuck in one of the little spots. You may be just stuck there with still having to deal with your parents' failures. Forgive them. Forgive them now. Don't let it go on. Don't let it fester. Don't let it go on. Forgive them now. Watch out for vanity. Just dispose of vanity. What people think about you. And worry about that. Be careful about your anger. Lose your anger. Lose your anger. Don't have an angry spirit. Don't have an angry heart. Don't let that anger come and fester. And because that anger then, after 2 years, just makes it so bitter. Bitterness destroyed him. So tonight, don't let it end that way for you. I can't let it hinder. By the way, A lot of times we think about the young folks in the story and their bitterness. But I know some folks right now that are 50 and 60 and very bitter because their parents right now aren't treating them right. Take them out of the inheritance. Ooh. Or maybe they're bitter with their kids because their kids aren't treating them right. Whew. Doesn't have to end that way. Oh, Absalom. Absalom. So let's forgive others. You and I ought to be able to look anybody in the eye and smile at them and love them in Christ, or we have a problem. But you don't know what they did. Don't be bitter with them. Now, I've said before, you may forgive a bank robber, but you don't let him hold your wallet. But if I look at somebody and I've got a pain because they said something to me, or they did something to me, or they didn't do it right, and oh, watch out, oh, Absalom. Oh, Absalom. Oh, I hate them. I hate them for what they did. Oh, Absalom. Oh, Absalom. I'm not going to obey them. I'm not going to follow those rules. I'm just so bitter. Oh, Absalom. Oh, Absalom. I know what I'll do. I'll convince these people to go against them too. I'll convince these people. Oh, Absalom. Oh, Absalom. Again, two reasons for the message tonight as we look at this. One, to check our own lives. It doesn't have to end that way. Two, to maybe understand somebody else. Not to condemn them, but to love them. To pray for them. Understand. Absalom. Whew. Such potential. What a sad ending. Oh, Absalom. Let's pray.